Hello, I'm Mark Lawson, president of the ECS Publishing Group, home to Galaxy Music Corporation. I'm pleased to be joined by Dr. Cindy Moyer, who is the music department chair at Humboldt State University in Arcata, California, and by our managing editor, Kevin Uppercue. We're here to discuss Dr. Moyer's collection of scales and arpeggios with shifting practice for violin or for viola. So welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Cindy, before we start discussing the book, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background, and maybe something about your current teaching situation?
So my mother was a violinist, and she went away to some of the very earliest Suzuki teacher training in America and came home when I was 5 years old, 6 years old, something like that, and said, "Oh, look, a guinea pig in my very house." And I started playing at that point, eventually switched to working with other teachers and went to Eastman, where most of my teachers had studied with Galamian. So I, at that point, did the Galamian scales. At Humboldt State University, I, at this point, am mainly the department chair, and so I'm not teaching a whole lot, but I am still teaching a number of community students as well as a few university ones. Most of my students sort of are in that intermediate between the Vivaldi A minor and the Bach A minor kind of territory. And oftentimes, even with more advanced ones, I end up with students who need some to go back and review basics of technique. And all of that sort of led into this book.
So those are the kinds of needs that you saw that made you want to produce this book?
I had been teaching scales without a book at all. I just sort of had a handout that had the fingerings in them. And I would get to the point where students were having problems doing the shifts in tune. And then we would spend 10 minutes of lesson time analyzing exactly how did you do those shifts properly and what should they do to practice them. And I got the sense that even after we had spent all of that time, the students didn't necessarily practice it because it wasn't laid out in a really easy way for them to do that. And so I wrote the first draft of what became this book, which was the scales, and then had the shifts with all the practice steps written out. And doing that made things work a whole lot better. Lesson time was used more efficiently and the students shifted better.
Okay, good. Well, I'm going to ask Kevin to share his screen, and maybe we can talk a little bit about some of the specifics to the approach.
So I'm curious, Cindy, had you always thought of scales in terms of the shifting? Is that how you learned sort of things? Or was it more just, okay, well, place your finger here, place your finger there, off you go kind of thing?
By the time you're doing 3-octave scales, there have to be shifts, and you start doing them at the stage of your development where you're probably working on positions and shifting otherwise. So students have already probably done some of these kinds of exercises. For a long time, it was sort of like, this is the fingering, shift here, and didn't worry about too much else. The more I started zeroing in on students who were struggling with things, the more I realized that, oh, if we just practiced this in an organized and efficient way, it would go so much better. And some of what I discovered sort of to my surprise was that it also means that students now know the steps for practicing shifts. And so when they have a problem shift somewhere in a piece, I can say, so you need to practice it like you do with the scale shifts. And they all know. Or the ones who maybe don't actually pay attention to what they're doing, we can at least go through the process. What is it that you do with those scale shifts, and how are you going to do this one? And it does save a lot of time, and they've learned some useful stuff.
Good. And so I have a sample up here, just starting right at the very beginning with the basics here with the key of G major. And so starting off here, we see two fingering sets, and they're labeled throughout as sort of fingerings above and fingerings below. And these pertain to the Galamian and Flesch systems that are in there, which are the two prominent systems for violinists and violists, correct?
Yes. Yeah. I was originally going to do just Galamian, and you folks sent me an email that said, could you do Flesch as well? And I thought, oh, how am I going to do that? And went for a walk. And by the time I was back from my walk, I was like, oh, yes, okay, I totally know how that's going to work. And so, yeah, so hopefully that makes it more useful for more teachers. Because one of the issues potentially with this book, given that the shifting practice is written out, you have to use the fingerings that are in the book. You can't be a teacher who changes the fingerings and uses your own personal one and have this book be effective for you. So at least hopefully you like either the Galamian fingerings or the Flesch fingerings.
And I think we should mention also, Kevin, right here, is the fact that we also are the publishers of the Galamian books. And so we do see this as leading into that series. But we did know that a lot of people use the Flesch system as well. So we wanted to make it as useful as possible.
And definitely my vision when I started this was that this would be preparatory to moving into the Galamian eventually.
And so all of these scales are 3 octaves. And then we have, you can see here sort of helpful things as far as lines to make sure that you're staying in position and for each of the scales that are there. So we have a 4-note groupings as well as, and I think this is unique, or at least partially unique to your book, to where you separated both 4-note groupings and 3-note groupings out from each other.
Yeah, and the reason I did this was that after my students first learn the scales, I have them do all sorts of different bowing and rhythm patterns. And most of them are completely unfazed by that. And some of them find it really hard to apply those patterns to the scales. And so having them written in groups of 3 or 4 helped immensely with that process. So that's why I did it. That's one of the things that went from the very first draft of this that I made and used with students for a couple years to the final version that got added because it became clear that it was helpful for some of the students.
And so after those 2 groupings, then we get to sort of the meat, as it were, of the books, being the shifting practice for the various fingerings. So you split these out between the top fingerings and the bottom fingerings, and go through every single shift within the scale. And you want to talk us through how you sort of flesh these out? No pun intended.
No, these are Galamian.
These are fleshed out. These are Galamianed out.
Exactly. Yes. So all of these start with the just the basic guide finger that is the foundation for the shift, and then we add the actual note that the student will be playing before the shift, keeping the guide finger in. And then the third step with the dotted rhythm gets the timing to be closer to the timing that they will have in the real shift. I think that's a really important step, and one that people often forget to do, and then they wonder why they've done really good practice of steps 1 and 2 and it's not working in real life. And I think that's because they don't practice timing close to real timing. And then, of course, there is the final shift at the end. And the way I do this with students in lessons is that we do the shifts first. That's the very first thing they'll play in their lessons. And, and for the students for whom shifting is new, I'm spending a lot of time making sure that they're very relaxed and that their hand is moving the right way and that they're landing in tune and that they're getting into the right kind of hand shape as they get up high. If you look at the second line of these, you can see there are these notes in parentheses. Those are for putting the 4th finger down because you have to get into that very different hand shape when you shift up high to 5th position and beyond. And if you can't put your 4th finger down, you are not in the right place. And if you can, you are. So some of my students play those and some of them don't. It kind of depends on their needs at any point along the line. So we do that first. And they don't generally have problems playing the key of G in tune, but they have all sorts of problems playing the key of B in tune and C sharp. So the fact that we've also spent the first bit of the lesson playing shifts in the key that they're going to be in seems to help get them oriented to the key and seems to increase the chances of success of actually staying in the key they're supposed to be in when we go to the scale, which is what we do next in the lessons. And as they get more skilled, by the time I have them doing fancy bowings and rhythms and things like that, I'm no longer hearing them do the shifts as part of each lesson. But if shifts aren't going well, I'll say things like, maybe you should go practice that shift again the way it's written out in the book.
Because that's, I mean, that's the hardest part, you know. I mean, if you're in position, you're in position, you know, you just put your finger down, you know, sort of. So it's interesting that you start, okay, let's do the shifts for the scale rather than, okay, let's work up to the first shift. Okay, start with G, A, B, you know, you go straight to the shift and say, okay, this is the most complicated, you know, part of what you're going to be doing. And then, you know, then when you get to the actual just stopping the notes that are there, it's like, okay, well, you know, that's the easy part, you know. So that's good. And then we also have you know, the Flesch as well, with the check notes up there, and the same way. All of these are you know, broken down into their component steps, along with, as you mentioned, the dotted rhythms that are in there for the timing. And then you included all three forms of the minor. So the traditional being harmonic and melodic, but you went with the natural as well. So do you want to talk about why you thought it was prudent and important to include that?
My first full-time job was teaching at Eastern Illinois University, and they had a policy that in order to move to junior standing, you did this big deal fancy jury, and they were expected to play all three forms of the minor scale there. And so I had to start dealing with all three forms of the minor scale.
Just in wrapping up, tell us what kind of results do you feel like you've seen from your students in using it?
It's made me more organized in working on shifting. And it's had that really beneficial thing that they know how to practice it. And so I can say for other things I did today in working with a student, perhaps you need to go back and do all the steps of how you know how to practice this. So that's helpful. We didn't talk about arpeggios, but that's also nice. I'm able to get to the arpeggios a little bit earlier than I did before. I used to use the Galamian arpeggios, and the Galamian arpeggios have some very interesting, harmonically complex arpeggios. There are ones with suspensions, there's an augmented triad, and students have a lot of trouble doing those. Those are quite difficult. So the arpeggios I have in here are not as challenging. They're your standard major and minor 1, 6, and 4, and then dominant sevenths and diminished sevenths. And so I can get to those earlier. The other thing that's kind of nice in the back of the book is that I wrote out all of the steps that I use to teach practicing beginning double stop scales. And that also saves a lot of time, that I don't have to spend a lot of time teaching them how to practice it. We can kind of talk through and spend more time listening to what they're doing. So all of that's been useful. But definitely the most productive thing, they shift better because I spend more time working on it, and they know how to practice shifts when they encounter them in other situations.
Well, thanks for taking time to visit about the book. It's really been a welcome addition to our catalog, and thank you so much for all the time you've spent on it. So,
well, and thank you.
You're welcome. So for those of you interested in seeing more about the book, it is available in all major music stores, and then you may find samples of the book on our website. You go to ecspublishing.com and you go to the instrumental area, and then you choose the methods button, and all of the methods show up, and it's prominently displayed right there. Or you can put Cindy's name in the quick search and go right to it. So thank you very much for taking time to watch this interview, and we wish you the very best. Thank you.